So picking up where we left off in ranking the top 10 greatest pirates in One Piece history, today we have the final 5. Definitely check out the previous video to see numbers 10 through 6. To start with, at number 5, we have Big Mom. Yes, Big Mom, she is ahead of the fan favorite Shanks. Look, Big Mom's an emperor, Shanks is an emperor. Shanks ended the war, yes. Maybe you don't think Big Mom has moments that are as cool as Shanks's, that's totally understandable, but the fact is that the vast majority of important characters in the One Piece world have a lot of respect for her and consider her just as big of a deal as the other emperors, so even though she's been memed by the community a little bit, this is how I'm going to take it, that she is just as big of a deal as the other emperors, and the important thing is, she's been doing this a lot longer than Shanks. In fact, out of the 4 emperors, she may have been ahead of the curve. We know that she had a road poneglyph a long while back that Roger stole from her, not to mention she was getting like 500 million berry bounties at a very young age. I wouldn't be surprised if she was a bigger name even before Whitebeard became a big name, though Whitebeard obviously passed her up later. So yes, Big Mom is an OG emperor, and she's been at or near the top a good decade or two longer than Shanks, so I'm putting her above him. As far as we know, Big Mom is one of the top 5 greatest pirates of all time, without a doubt. At number 4 we have Kaido, and I'm putting Kaido above Big Mom. Now this was a tricky one, they have pretty similar careers, but this feels like a sports argument where it comes down to longevity versus peak. Yeah, Big Mom was a bigger name somewhat earlier than Kaido. She hit 500 million well before joining Rox's crew, whereas Kaido was specifically said to be just an apprentice on Rox's ship. So Big Mom had a head start, but it sounds like the main rise of Kaido and Big Mom both happened during Roger's era, after Rox was disbanded, and Kaido clearly became a great pirate during Roger's era at some point, just like her. So she's been a great pirate for longer than Kaido, but not by a huge amount from what we can tell. However, on the other hand, Kaido today is considered the world's strongest creature. Whether he actually is or not, we don't know for sure, but the point is, it seems like he's kind of picked up the title of strongest pirate after Whitebeard died, at least to most people. And even other emperors like Blackbeard and Big Mom speak about Kaido like he's different. So at least he's attained that perception or special status today. So longevity goes to Big Mom, but peak reputation goes to Kaido. And just based on those 2 factors, I'll give it to Kaido because I just think it's very rare to be considered the strongest pirate at any time, so I think that's worthy of putting him above her. And again, it's not just about strength, but strength does play a part in status as a pirate, and because it's so close between these 2, I'm giving it to Kaido because of the status as the strongest that he currently has. Kaido has the status of being the top dog right now, just not by a clear margin the way Roger and later on Whitebeard did, as Doflamingo's speech suggests. That's also reflected in Kaido's bounty being the highest at the moment, which again goes to status and reputation. Just for a few extra stuff, I'll add in that I also personally get the feeling that his crew is more formidable than Big Mom, so that's a personal opinion. It's not really proven yet, I admit. And lastly, it just sounds like Kaido may have racked up the most extensive battle record, basically the most infamous resume of the current Yonko. Again, he was introduced having fought all the emperors and the marines, most of his crew is composed of strong pirates that he defeated and broke, and the way Brand New introduced him, it sounded like he has a very battle-heavy history. So Kaido's number 4, just a bit above Big Mom, but they're both far, far below the top 3. Okay, number 3 and number 2 were by far the hardest for me to order. I think they could easily be swapped, and I know a lot of people will be upset that I put the Great Whitebeard so low, but I personally think it makes sense when I get to my argument for number 2. So, at least in the modern day of One Piece, the time frame that the story is taking place in, Whitebeard was the standard for greatness in the modern day. Like, there were 3 other emperors, but Whitebeard was clearly portrayed as the greatest of the 4. If we talk about strength, then after Roger died and for basically the entirety of the Great Pirate era, Whitebeard was considered the clear strongest pirate in the world. He was the top dog, and even if you think he wasn't the strongest by the time of Marineford, the fact is everyone still gave him that title till the end. And that's all that matters for the purposes of this video, since this isn't a power scaling ranking video, this is about greatness. So perceived strength actually matters more, because the point is his status as the strongest pirate was basically intact for the entire 20 years after Roger died, till Whitebeard's own death. During that time, nobody believed the other Yonko overtook him as the top dog, as the strongest pirate in the seas. Even the other emperors speak of Whitebeard as though he is greater than the rest of them. Even someone like Kaido is chasing Whitebeard's greatness and trying to emulate it in some way. Whitebeard is basically the measuring stick that other characters use to explain why the other emperors are so great. And we can see that even though Whitebeard is nowhere near as violent as Kaido or Big Mom, his bounty is still somehow solidly higher than theirs. The only pirate his bounty is comparable to is Roger's, and that's really the biggest thing this comes down to. Whitebeard ranks so high on this list because really he should have been so much more than just an emperor. Whitebeard could have been the next pirate king. He just chose not to. Throughout the story, the character Whitebeard is regularly paired with and compared to is not the other emperors, it's the pirate king Gold Roger. Roger and Whitebeard were basically the gold standard. As we are told, the sea is filled with second place finishers to them, meaning it was those two and then everybody else. It's just that Whitebeard never lived up to what Roger was, even though he could have. It was believed that the Great Pirate Era, the era after Roger's, should have been Whitebeard's era. We had Rox's era, then we had what everyone considered to be Roger's era, and then the expectation was that once Roger was gone, it was now clearly Whitebeard's time to be the king of the seas and have his era. That was what Doflamingo's entire speech spelled out, that Roger was the king, and then Whitebeard was the next in line, but for whatever reason, he chose not to stake his claim as the king. That's exactly what Shiki says, that now that Roger is gone, it's obviously time for Whitebeard's era. That the only thing is that nobody else knew was that Whitebeard never cared about any of that. Pirates like Roger and Luffy want to be declared king. Whitebeard doesn't. And really, the fact that Whitebeard ended up as just one of the 4 emperors is falling short of what he could have been, because it's made clear that he could have been more. However, even though he chose not to be the king in that sense, even then everyone still knew he was the king of the seas in spirit in some sort of unofficial way. As the point of Doflamingo's speech again is that Whitebeard chose to kneel before the throne, but it was still basically his throne. And only now that Whitebeard is gone is there now finally an actual vacuum at the top. I mean, Garp outright calls Whitebeard the king of the seas, which is what the Pirate King essentially is. However, ultimately the reason Whitebeard doesn't rank higher for me is because it's his own fault. He was never interested in being the greatest pirate or being the king of anything. Maybe if he really felt like it in his prime, he could have crushed the other emperors. Who knows? But at the end of the day, what should have been Roger as the king, and then Whitebeard as the king after him, was instead Roger as the king, and then Whitebeard kind of just letting 3 other pirates share his spot at the top. And yeah, that's not a failure on Whitebeard's part. He never wanted to be a king. He just wanted a family. And in a way that makes him the greatest pirate of all, but in a much more real way, it doesn't. He never truly had an era for himself, at least not a time that was universally accepted as his era. Like, for every ace that claims this was Whitebeard's era, you'll get people like Akainu who see Whitebeard as falling short in the shadow of Roger. This is definitely going to be controversial, but I ultimately did give the nod to Rox over Whitebeard. To start with, again, I'm putting a lot of value on it being someone's era. We know for a fact that Roger had his era, and we know for a fact that Rox had the era before Roger. Whitebeard should have had his own era, but he chose not to make it his era. And then nobody has the current era, that's what they're fighting for. At the end of the day, right, the only 2 pirates who definitively had their own eras were Roger and Rox. You could get nitpicky and argue that technically it was the era of the Rox crew as a whole, but come on, it was called the Rox crew. It was his crew. He was the captain. It was his era. He was the king. Now, yes, Whitebeard had some solid longevity over Rox, he became the top dog alongside Roger during Roger's era, and he maintained the spot as the top dog into the next era. But I just don't think that matches up to the insanity that is the peak of Rox and his crew. The Rox pirates are, by far, the greatest pirate crew of all time. It's just not debatable. I want you all to think back to chapter 957 and the first time you read it, because it's easy to forget your first impressions when they were so long back, but for every One Piece reader who read chapter 957 and got to the page explaining what the Rox pirates were, I don't think there was a single reader who was not completely mind blown at the idea of 3 out of the 4 Yonko on the same crew under one captain. And then on top of that, famous names like Shiki, like Captain John just being casually thrown in, not to mention our own inferences that Characters like Shaki were on that crew as well. This was the ultimate super crew. I don't believe for a second that any reader read those pages and did not immediately think that this was something way bigger than any of us could have possibly imagined in this story. The idea that a force like this actually existed at one point, and again, that it was all under one man. And yes, obviously not everyone in this crew was in their primes, but that's not the point. The point is that almost every legendary pirate in history was on Rox's crew. Half of this list so far is literally just Rox's crew. Every reader, when they read these pages, must have thought that this is bigger than the Roger pirates, this is bigger than the Whitebeard pirates, this is just bigger than anything else we've ever heard of before, and Oda played that up and acknowledged that throughout the chapter. That's what he wanted us to feel like. That was pretty much all of the characters in that chapter's reactions, that this is the most insane crew of all time. It makes no sense that it even existed. And so I would confidently say that while Whitebeard had greater longevity, Rox had, without a doubt, the greatest peak as a pirate of all time. He had what sounds like all of the greatest pirates in the world, except for Roger, all of the greatest pirates in the world of his era working underneath him all at the same time. They were described as a rampaging force of evil that no one could stop. So this isn't like the emperors who have spent decades in a stalemate. This isn't even like Roger, who definitely had his back against the wall multiple times. You know, we know his crew could be stalemated by the Whitebeard pirates. It sounds like Garp and Sengoku gave Roger trouble. The Rox pirates were basically described as unstoppable. Because consider this, what it took to bring them down in the end was the greatest pirate of all time and the greatest marine of all time working together. That's what it took to match the Rox pirates. First of all, consider the level of this battle, featuring pretty much every emperor, then Rox, Roger, Rayleigh, and Garp in their primes. That is by far the highest level battle we've ever heard about in One Piece. It makes Marineford look like nothing. We had Whitebeard on his deathbed, still taking care of business at Marineford. The incident that ended Rox's career, what it took to end Rox, was the greatest pirate battle that we had ever heard of. Again, the greatest pirate of all time, and the greatest marine of all time had to team up to take down Rox and his crew at their peak because nothing else could do it. Roger and his crew couldn't do it alone. It took the Roger pirates plus Garp. And if the Roger pirates couldn't do it alone, then that means that there's pretty much no crew in history that comes even close to the Rox pirates. So it's basically just an absurdly high peak that Rox hit. Like, he wanted to be king of the world, not just king of the pirates. And it sounds like he basically would have accomplished it if not for some of the strongest characters in all of One Piece history in their primes joining forces to take him and his crew down. And in terms of Rox's individual strength, I don't know, I think we can safely assume he is among the top few strongest characters we know of in One Piece, and Sengoku did describe him as Roger's greatest foe. You can interpret that in many ways. Greatest might mean, strongest, in which case Rox would be even stronger than Whitebeard. Greatest in the more general sense would also mean Rox is just the greatest, most legendary pirate Roger ever fought, again, which would put him above Whitebeard for the purposes of this list. Or maybe it means greatest in a more personal way, like Rox was Roger's personal arch-nemesis, not necessarily his strongest opponent. But who knows, that's still like a really great accolade to give Rox, that he was Roger's greatest foe. But no matter what, that's some serious clout, basically. I think the only real problem for Rox is that his legacy kind of got snuffed out to a degree, through no fault of his own, because the world government so aggressively tried to cover up everything about him because everything he did was so dangerous. As such, he's not nearly as famous as you would expect today. However, on the flip side, you could argue that he did in fact leave a tremendous legacy and impact on the pirate world, even if the public don't fully realize it. Out of the current 4 emperors, 2 of them came out of Rox's crew, with Kaido in particular specifically being Rox's apprentice. Then Blackbeard, on top of that, was pretty clearly inspired by Rox and is following in his footsteps, even naming his ship after him. And lastly, there's even a popular and compelling theory that Shanks is actually Rox's son. So it's entirely possible that the entire landscape of pirates at the top of the world today, literally all 4 Yonko, are products of Rox in some way, even 40 years after his death. Roger and Whitebeard's influence is probably more overtly obvious to the public and the general pirate world, but with Rox, even despite a massive world government cover-up attempt on him, he still ended up influencing the pirate world for the next 40 years after his death. And lastly, of course, the obvious number 1 is Gold Roger. Now, I don't know if there's even any need to make an argument for this. Roger is literally the Pirate King, the only person ever to be called the King of the Pirates. That should be the end of the argument. That's it, case closed. The title of Pirate King speaks for itself. The King of all pirates, literally no one else has had it since. Roger's the only one who has officially taken the spot as the King of the Seas. However, I guess I will quickly run through why this is such a clear-cut choice, or else I may get some complaints. So, going back to Rox, who I talked up so much before this, well, when we all read this chapter 957, and basically collectively had our minds blown by the idea that all these legendary pirates were once united in some sort of a super crew under one man, every reader's immediate reaction to this was basically that this is just too big. It doesn't make sense. One guy leading all of these figures, Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, Shiki, and so on. This guy wanted to be the king of the world. No one could stop him and his super crew. It just sounded like this was bigger than anything we'd heard of in this series before. Easily bigger than the Yonko today, or even the Roger Pirates, right? Until we turn the page and find out that no. That's what makes Roger so great. Roger was in fact the one who took Rox down. Now, obviously Roger and his crew did it with Garp's help. No pirate crew could beat the Rox pirates alone, but still, from the framing of this visual and how Sengoku phrases it, it definitely sounds like Rox was mainly Roger's enemy, and Roger walked away from this battle with the win and as the greatest pirate alive. Rox's era ended there, and he was erased from the history books. So, that's number one. Roger comes out as the winner from the greatest battle in One Piece that we know of. He ends Rox's era, and then he begins his era. And we don't know all the details of Roger's era, except that there was literally only one pirate who was ever even capable of fighting toe-to-toe with him during this time, and basically everyone else was just a second place finisher to these two. And before Whitebeard fans try to argue that this should then be considered Roger and Whitebeard's era, no. First of all, Whitebeard wasn't in his prime when this era started. It took some time for him to even gather a crew and become a great pirate with a crew that could fight Roger's. And on top of that, the general perception was that Roger was greater than Whitebeard, and that Whitebeard was basically waiting his turn to be the top dog once Roger was gone. Again, obviously, nobody knew that Whitebeard didn't care about being number one, but that's not relevant. The point is that the perception was that this was Roger's era. The perception was that Roger was an insurmountable wall for everyone, including Whitebeard. So Roger enjoys 20 years at the top, then finishes off by getting to the final island on the Grand Line, a feat that no pirate had ever done before, and was then named the undisputed King of the Pirates. Since then, no one has ever gotten this title. And then finally, how did Roger's time come to an end? He wasn't defeated in a battle like Rox. He wasn't defeated in a battle like Whitebeard. No one took Roger down, and it's implied that no one could take Roger down. He went out on his own terms, exactly when he wanted and how he wanted, closing the current era and starting the next era of his own free will. And in doing so, he left a legacy that is way, way bigger than any other pirates. Literally the entire story of One Piece, everything we've read so far, this giant competition that has emerged, it's all happening in Roger's shadow. It's literally all Roger, and it's carried over across multiple eras. It's not like anything's changed after Whitebeard's death and Marineford. It's still Roger's legacy that everyone is chasing. So just think about that for a little bit. I've talked about pirates like Rox who had his own era, and Whitebeard who kind of sort of had his own era, but their eras ended when they were defeated. Roger's story, on the other hand, is he started off by ending the era of the previous top dog, Rox, winning the greatest pirate battle of all time. Then he had his own 20-year era where he was considered the greatest, and he finished his era by pulling off a feat that was so great that everyone literally dubbed him the first and only king of the pirates. And finally, he was never dethroned or defeated or knocked off his pedestal. He chose on his own to go out in a way that created the next era after that, with all the pirates of that new era he created just chasing his ghost. And it's still going, even into the current era, the New Age. Everyone's still trying to catch up to Roger. So basically, Roger had a Michael Jordan-esque career. Once he got to the top, there's nothing that can really be said to take away from him. He was the greatest for as long as he was around, and he basically walked off when he was at the top. He had just found Raftel, was named the king, and then he turned himself in. And just to put into perspective, I think it's almost easy to forget just how great Roger is painted out to be in the story. Like, His name comes up honestly very infrequently in the series, but that makes him more legendary in a way. For example, one of those rare occasions he's mentioned is Mont Dior talking about how absolutely impossible it is for Luffy to escape with all the defenses they've set up. He says it's so impossible that the Pirate King Gold Roger himself could walk through that mirror and not escape. Think about that. That's how Roger is referenced when someone wants to use absolute hyperbole to make a point. Like Mont Dior is referencing him like he's a mythical being or something. This is basically the One Piece world's version of saying God himself could walk through that mirror and we wouldn't let him get away. And similarly, we take for granted that everyone's so crazy about the One Piece, but what does it say about Roger and the reputation that he gathered during his era that would make the entire world believe that his treasure is something they must all chase? Sure, what's lying on Raftel, we know it's not gold and jewels that Roger accrued, but the point is the perception. Roger just tells everyone that everything he's gathered over his pirate career is all in one place. And everyone's perception is that, because this pirate's career is so ridiculously legendary, that what he must have gathered over his lifetime would be an unimaginably huge treasure that is worth dying for. And then for the next 22 years, everyone did just chase after it. Just the idea of what someone like Roger must have left behind is enough to dictate the next 2 decades of the One Piece world history. So the bottom line is that while yes, other pirates may have been as strong as him, other pirates may have had stronger crews than him, at the end of the day, no pirate is even close to as great as the one and only Pirate King. So if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon to get my extended thoughts on this and all future topics, link in the description below.